Okay.
Here we go.
Great. I think we're good.
Yeah, I think that's a good
It's critical
cue to
mass.
start. We got critical
This is
mass.
great.
Yeah.
I think people will jump on.
People jump on.
Mhm.
All right, everyone. Welcome everyone to our first episode of Professional Confessionals. I am your host, Sharon Haar, Professor of Architecture at Taubman College, who has been generously asked to host these events, and I'm really excited to do it. I'm gonna do a little bit of screen sharing, not much, but just so we know where we're at. Except that I didn't share, I just went right into my right in there. So, you all know where we're at. This is just for some background. So episode 1 of 4, I'll discuss the other 3 towards the end of our hour. As I think most of you know, Professional Confessionals is brought to you by Taubman Public Design Corps. And Taubman Public Design Corps is working with the Edward Ginsburg Center with multiple units across our college, with a number of organizations, nonprofit organizations in southeastern Michigan, and a number of our faculty and students who are interested in working with community organizations on pressing economic, environmental, social, and spatial challenges, which have always been there, but have been made even more acute by our ongoing health crisis today. This is an amazing set of activities pulled together by the Office of our Associate Dean of Outreach and many other fabulous and academic initiatives, Anya Sirota, who we'll hear from today. And it's really, I'd say, we have a college that has been engaged in lots of disparate ways in socially driven design through individual enterprises of faculty and students and staff. I think for me, one of the things that's really exciting about the Public Design Corps of this summer and hopefully moving into the future is the opportunity that it offers us to participate in public interest design and in social impact more, I'd say, at the level of our college and in dialogue with one another and with others, to sort of bring these conversations together and allow us to work on our equity and inclusion with our neighbors, with our communities, with one another. And also, I think very important at this moment is to allow our students to see how their own work can impart spatial thinking into the thinking of public nonprofit organizations. Today, we are with our professional confessionals with us. The point of the professional confessionals is to allow our faculty to share projects with students that engage in questions and issues of social impact, and to frame that in terms of a larger conversation around what our students themselves might be able to do in their own practice and in their own work. I don't know that Anya needs very much introduction, but I'm going to provide one anyway because I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. As you know, Anya is an architectural designer. She's an associate dean of academic initiatives and many other cool and amazing things here at Taubman College. And equally important, she is a founding principal of a COACI. Her work is situated at the intersections of architecture and urban design, and it explores how a distinct synthesis of aesthetic, social enterprise, and cultural programming can offer contemporary and multidisciplinary strategies for urban transformations. I think that's like such an amazing sentence. I think only because of the pandemic, Anya is finding herself here in Ann Arbor for more extended periods of time than she usually sits in one place. She's usually to be found somewhere on the road, presenting her work, whether at Vitra, at the Brussels Design Museum, at the San Etienne Design Biennale, at the Chicago Cultural Center, down in Mexico City. Every so often she seems to crop up in Paris, having conversations with former students of mine from completely different settings and environments. She's all over the place. She's also the recipient of the Architectural League Prize, the ACSA Faculty Design Award, the South by Southwest EcoPlace Design Award, an R&D Award, and many other really amazing things. And most recently, part of a team that won the design of the Cultural District of Detroit with a project called Detroit Square. I don't know if this is the project she's going to talk about, so I'm not going to say anything about it. But even if she's not, check it out. It can be found all over the web. I encourage you to see what they're up to. I know it's on their website. With that, I've said way too much, and I'm going to give the screen over to Anya for the purpose of her presentation, and we're going to reserve quite a bit of for conversation, confessionals, and so I encourage everyone out there to prepare some questions. I have one or two of my own, but if you don't ask any, I will call upon you to ask them. So may as well volunteer. It's the summer, it's light. Let's have some fun with that.
Wow, Sharon, that was serious. Thank you so much. I have to confess that
I got dressed up for this.
You look great. I did too.
I wanted some beret, yeah. First confessional, shorts or pants?
No idea. Yours? I mean, I don't know. Mine?
Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And thank you for agreeing to MC this conversation.
My pleasure.
Yeah, this effort has been launched by a group of colleagues with Maria Arquero, who's here, Jacob Comerci, Irene Huang, and then we've spread the love and we've invited whoever wants to help with this initiative into the fold. So even if you're not part of it now, but this looks appealing, please contact us because there's so much work to be done and so much thinking. And it's quite challenging. And I think we received far more interest than we ever imagined. And our sentiment is that this might very well continue. So growing our mentorship base is going to be critical for being able to sustain this. The idea behind the confessionals was to shine light on some of our personal experiences, but also on certain words, syntaxes, definitions, cultural misconstructions that come with this notion of community engagement. What is community? Who are we engaging? To what end? What is public design? And for each one of us who is part of this 4-part series, and hopefully this is something that continue, can nuance those terms, nuance that understanding through personal experience in the field. And then open conversations in the most transparent and agonistic way to the trials, tribulations, and foils of some of our assumptions as we work toward ideas of impacting social good. So I am going to share my screen now. And because we are quite a compact, oh, this is telling me I can't. Open systems preferences, sorry. So we have new, okay, now I think I can. Okay. I can.
It's
all
I just
possible.
gave you permission.
Yeah. So can everyone see this screen? Is that good? All right, fab. Designer. And I find myself very Okay, we're recording again. So now it will not be known which school I went to, but I went to a very formalist school, and during this time in my graduate education, I became quite enamored with movement around social design that originated, I would say, in France, but was also replicated in the European context and centered around architects such as Patrick Bouchin, who were really good friends with very dubious philosophers like Michel Onfray. And there was this sentiment that if architecture could unbind itself from the logistics of business and currency and profit and exchange, that if one was to dispossess oneself as a designer from the influences of architectural production and liberate ourselves from consumerism, for instance, we might be able to operate in the space of being urban outliers, and however tentatively we might be able to make some sort of transformation in the way we live and operate in the built environment. This was a highly unpopular position in my university, and even to the extent that when I presented my my final thesis project, I was asked not to present in the main space of the common review space, but in a sort of sidebar closet. That went very well. But nonetheless, I persevered with this idea that it's possible for architecture, however briefly and however naively, to attempt to peel itself away from its perennial attachment and from the critique of its attachment to its dependence on power and capital. And I've spent the last 10 years or so trying to figure out what that might look like, what it can do, and how we might be critical about that proposition. And so my office has spent time making urban signifiers like the mothership, or scenographies for outdoor operas, or floating signifiers in abandoned tannery tanks, or creating clip-on arches to instigate ephemeral institutions where these institutions don't exist except for a desire in the collective imaginary. You could say in some sense that this has been an attempt to enact a sort of activist architecture. Ole Bauman would call this unsolicited architecture. I'm not sure that I truly agree with this term, considering that even unsolicited architecture is paid for by some sort of an institutional interest. But an example of the kind of work we did in the early parts of our practice was sneak into an abandoned factory in Chelsea, Michigan, notice that kids were smoking a lot of dope there, and figure out that it was slated for demolition, and then create an installation in the boiler room. So the interior of this installation would produce a poor man's Anish Kapoor effect: no electricity, only natural light, $2,000 of materials, everything built in situ, and a kind of preservationist case for the possibilities, beauty, and delight of being able to occupy spaces of transgression and teenage pleasure. And so we also always connected our interventionist practice with openings, with some sort of conversation about what the context appears like, how it participates in aesthetic discourse and in critical discourse. And for example, when we built this installation, we also collaborated with the Playboy bunny, Brandy Moses, who created a recording of texts by Viollet Leduc and John Ruskin. And those were installed in this intervention so that on occasion, when kids were in there smoking pot, they would encounter the whispering voice of Brandy Moses sharing
Tell me,
some
to whom these roads
discourse
belong,
about
that I may
alienation of the
still
collective
the
imagination.
sole way of obtaining anything when one is poor. Alas, there.
So we did things like attempt to halt the auction of the Packard automotive plant when it went up for sale in the city by creating an installation and a public exhibit on the roof of that building. We brought the entry condition and the staircase up to code. We're very keen about safety. And we garnered, or we galvanized, a research team of students from the former MS conservation program. And then we hosted an event to which we invited neighbors, residents, collaborators, foundations, even people who work on scrapping the building in order to ignite and stimulate a conversation about the possible futures that are collective and multiplicitous, rather than the return to a normalized real estate value for that site. Of course, our invited guests and the public remained unswayed. And when we launch projects that look at the collective landscape, for example, this master planning effort with the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm called Detroit Cultivator, we're always attempting to create events, atmospheres, and conditions where the legibility of the proposal is rendered explicit, where artists are invited to intervene and create installations in conjunction with the architectural artifacts, where the possibility of performance coexists with architectural production. So there is no longer a hierarchy between space making, performance, and program, but rather a horizontality about the possibility of mixing space and its projected activity. And this is Onyx Ashanti on the left, with Pierre Lambla performing in a greenhouse full of tomatoes. And of course, I don't do this alone. I wish I was the star, but I'm not. And I do most of this work with a very ornery, difficult anarchist Frenchman who's standing here. This is Jean-Louis Farge, my partner. And this is in our barn where many of the prototypes for our installations and our scenographic efforts have been constructed and tested. In this shot, you see there's a little drone that we typically use to fly through abandoned properties to make sure that there are no rabid dogs. There are other tools and accoutrements, lots of pink, cheap, blingy materials to raise the value proposition of the imageability of place that we are often involved with. And to be completely transparent, we took this photo not long after Annie Leibovitz made this photo. Let's see, this one. I'm very sorry to make this photo public, but Jean-Louis insisted that there was something to be learned from this photo taken by Annie Leibovitz, where he saw that she was laying bare the instruments of power, the real estate, the beige opulence, the imitation rococo, the commodification of the female body with the windswept outfit, the modeling of conspicuous consumption as a way of moving forward in society and the world, and then the plush overstuffed toys in this space of possibility. And so Jean-Louis was very keen on us showing also what our tools of power are in a similar landscape, and suggesting that they too can make impact in a non-commodified sense. So I'm hoping to talk about these issues that have driven our practice in 3 short chapters. The first is called Bye Bye Binaries. And when I was in graduate school working on my thesis, I became increasingly interested in the difficult spaces of trauma and their repossession and reappropriation for cultural infrastructure. For example, one place I studied very carefully was the 104, which is a morgue converted into a kind of cultural center dance hall. On the right is an image of when the space first opened. It was unvisited by most people in the neighborhood in the 19th arrondissement. It was a failure. An enormous amount had been spent on transforming the space into a site of cultivation, good taste, and aesthetic prowess. And then ultimately, a new curator came in and did a couple of very smart things. The new curator added electrical plugs, allowed people to bring their own music, and added informal furniture, and now you cannot get a spot in that place, and it's inhabited by everyone from the city regularly. Another site of this kind of tension and juxtaposition that I studied carefully was the Nazi submarine base in Saint-Nazaire called Aviol 14. And the dilemma of this site was that it was built over the span of 2 years during the Nazi occupation of France. It was built very quickly through forced labor. It's very, very heavy. It has a 35-foot thick bomb shelter proof roof, and stories abound about bodies being buried in the concrete. And so there's both the trauma of the labor that went into it, the occupation, the buried histories, but also the impossibility of demolishing the site. And so Lynn Architects worked on simply making cuts through the site and beginning to occupy the roof with Gilles Clément, allowing the landscape to retain the story of place. The walls still have the inscriptions from Nazi occupation, but at the same time, entering with the possibility of alternate programming, alternate imaginaries. And finally, projects like Belle de Mai, which is another one of Patrick Bouchin's projects, which very intentionally mix social class and create social tensions in order to allow for and encourage mixity. So for example, the second floor of the Belle de Mai, which is in a working class neighborhood in Marseille, its access to the swank restaurant is only made possible through an entry point that moves the public directly through a skate park, and then makes it inevitable that one would meet or rub shoulders with people from other groups, conditions, and classes. And so in essence, I've always been very interested in this border condition, the juxtaposition of the natural, the artificial, the constructed, the difficult, the reappropriated, the spaces that have dropped out of normative real estate circulation, and what architecture can do in those places of permanent and difficult adaptation. So when we first moved to Detroit, there were plenty of sites with difficult histories, complex possibilities, and questions about what architecture could do. But to be completely honest, for the first 4 years that we lived in Michigan, we did not take a single photo of Detroit. There was a sense that there was already enough representation of ruination that was circulating, and the mere juxtaposition of a form against the difficulties of the urban crisis seemed extractive in the most simple sense. But ultimately, after about 4 years of moving carefully, meeting people, we decided to work in the North End, where we began to establish contacts with certain artists and certain organizations. It's a neighborhood that's missing about 70% of its built structures. Its demographics are 95% African American. The poverty rate is quite high, higher than the rest of Detroit, and the illiteracy rate is high as well. And if you were to drive through this neighborhood, there's no historical marker that clearly connects it to its legacy and cultural heritage of being the site of Black Bottom, to its influence on vanguard music culture at a global scale. And of course, in the American context, there's no cultural ministry to allow for projects of, that reevaluate cultural assets in complex urban conditions to thrive. And so here, working in this context as architects, we had to figure out how to self-fund projects by putting on the appearance of artists rather than architects, because architecture was fathomed to be connected with normative commercial practices, where arts and art practices were being funded through foundation dollars and being instrumentalized towards social good. So we had to oscillate between the desire for spatial interventionist projects, but the camouflage of being artists in the practice. So our first step was to set up shop, and we opened the Bureau of Emergent Urbanity, where we converted a a barber shop into an experimental space for cultural production. This programming in this space ran for a full year, and this is what we imagined as being our community engagement. We never asked people what they wanted to see, how they wanted to change their neighborhood, what they wanted to do in the neighborhood, what kind of plan they were interested in. Instead, we simply offered heat, Wi-Fi, we revamped the interior, and we invited anyone in the neighborhood who needed a space for cultural programming to use that space. And slowly but surely, we began to cull and understand stories connected to place. So we ran this programming, and as we ran this programming, we began to understand that our language that came from a different context didn't quite match up to the language of place that we were communicating with in the North End. For one, people were using the term community very openly, and we were uncertain about what it meant, specifically in the Detroit or the American context. We began to understand that it was, in certain senses, a code word for all of the things that couldn't be said about racial difference, social difference, that it became a placeholder for binary oppositions between outsiders and insiders, between those groups that are geolocalizable and those that have the freedom and the privilege to be ethereal actors at a global scale. And so we began to think about how we might be able to reconstitute or reconfigure or redefine the term community and get on the same page with our collaborators and our partners. In our understanding, the word community tracks back to an etymology of the communards, who were a group of radical Parisian revolutionaries who ruled in Paris between March and May of 1871. In this image, we see the communards, the social movement literally called themselves the community. They had just toppled a monument in the Place de Vendôme. And beginning in May 21, 1871, this image was used as a testament to round up every person in this photograph, including the women and children, and to execute them all for resisting. So in many ways, the Paris Commune highlighted the characteristics that have come to define a contemporary understanding of community. It's a group of people that identify as a collective or on ideological grounds, often in resistance to a majority or a hierarchy. Its identity is imageable, it's discernible, it's photographable, it's reproducible, and the identification of the community offers the possibility of repression or distortion. In the critical essay, The Community Practicing Commitment, the historian Richard Sennett suggests that community entered our everyday parlance at precisely and perversely the same time when neighborhoods and housing projects were under attack in the 50s through urban renewal, blight remediation, and urban reconstruction. And so we've worked judiciously on being able to open up this notion of community to be more pluralistic. So of course, it is a geographic term. It is localizable. There are people that are in direct contact with the things that you make and the projects that you do. But we also think of community as one that is ideological, where people who believe or share a set of values, regardless of where they are on the planet, they can, for a brief time or for an extended span, belong to a self-similar community. People of privilege, for instance, belong to multiple communities at the same time and can find themselves as they travel and leave their geolocalizable space. And finally, we began to talk about community as an ephemeral construct, that when we staged events for a short span of time, because of the collective experience of those events, those too produced a momentary, if ephemeral, community. So building on these ideas of a community as a non-unilateral ideal, as something pluralistic, layered, complex, difficult to define, open-ended, we were able to begin to understand certain stories of place about the North End. In particular, for example, the Phelps Lounge emerged as the site where George Clinton had transformed into Dr. Frankenstein. We talked to many people in the community who told us stories about a 3-day transformation that happened in this building on the left, where George Clinton transformed from a regular kind of musician and crooner into something of great, audacious, and vanguard sophistication conceptually. And whether that was true or not was rather irrelevant to us, but it began to clarify the space of vanguard funk cultural production in the collective imaginary in the North End. And so ultimately, these are the kinds of conversations that led us to build objects to tell the story of place without lament or nostalgia. But it also encouraged us to bring together the musicians, the working class musicians, who once played with Parliament Funkadelic. So this is Am Fiddler on the left, who was Prince's keyboardist, who was still living in the neighborhood. And in back of him is the original drummer from P-Funk. And so bringing together the cultural assets of place, illustrating that the talent was still there, that the audience was still there, that 700 people could meet in an unmarked garage for a collective experience. For us, that was a first step in the creation and the cultivation of an image of community. And so in our practice, these kinds of efforts require new modes of representation that are simple, communicable, but also begin to measure the difficult challenges of making the right decisions about the right things. So this is our diagram for why building a mothership makes sense in the North End. And the second chapter of the confessional is about our notion of depoliticizing in order to repoliticize issues in complex urban environments. And in particular, I wanted to discuss a city, Ostia, that has a particular place in my experience and in my understanding of political possibilities in the urban realm. So Ostia is 30 kilometers southwest of Rome, and La Dispioli is another 40 kilometers northwest of Rome. These were two seaside resorts. They were really micro suburbs of Rome. And in 1976, Ostia became part of the commune of Rome. And nowadays, due to the expansion of the city, if you take the train, you might not even notice that you've entered Ostia, except for the park of Castelfusano, which separates Ostia from the rest of the peripheral matter that defines Rome. This is where Pasolini filmed his famous scenes from Acaton, and where he produced his film titled Ostia in 1970. And it also is the beach where he was found murdered in 1975. After World War II, there were bathing establishments that came to define this seaside resort that connected to districts in Rome. But however, around mid-70s, there was quite a bit of pollution, sea pollution, and also the pollution that came from the airport that's very close to the site. It began to create a certain number of vacancies in Ostia and La Dispioli. And so it became less fashionable for middle class and upper middle class citizens of Rome to come here in the summer. They would leave. And so a good portion of this urban fabric became vacant quite early in the 70s. Now, also in this time, there were about 500,000 Jews that were leaving the Soviet Union through Chop in Czechoslovakia and Vienna, Austria, and they were moving through Europe with Israeli passports. Of these, 189,000 people chose not to go to Israel, but instead became refugees in Italy, in the neighborhoods of Ostia and La Dispioli, hoping to secure visas to the US, to Canada, to Australia, and elsewhere. So the extraordinary reality of this neighborhood on the margins of Rome is that for over 20 years, they offered a unique urban typology. This was a fragmented refugee camp, seamlessly inserted into the fabric of the city. Approximately 40,000 Soviet Jews moved through this space every year with the help of the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society and other NGOs for resettlement. There were 3 families packed into each unit, wherever they were available, and dispersed equally throughout Ostia and La Dispioli, rendering invisible, to the best of their ability, the constant streaming presence in essentially, and in essence, depoliticizing the influx of migration and othering. So over the course of these 2 decades, this fragmented refugee camp operated without noticeable backlash or political fluctuation, as we see currently in areas like Calais or Copenhagen and Malta, where the visible influx of migrants has augmented fears of national dissolution, veering the kind of political ethos solidly toward the right. So in Ostia and Ladispioli, an ideological confluence between the government, which at that time was a socialist party, coupled with spatial and economic opportunity, the availability of flats, and external resources, so international aid, allowed for the tactical depoliticization of politically volatile scenarios, which in turn prolonged the operative span of deeply political acts, namely hospitality toward migrants. So it's difficult to imagine today, if you visit Ostia, that in this urban context, this was the first fragmented resettlement camp in Europe. And over these 2 decades, it was home to quite a number of American immigrants, Masha Gessen, Regina Spektor, Vitaly Komar, Svetlana Bayum. They all moved through this neighborhood, and they all participated in this ephemeral and temporary reconstruction, deconstruction, and reconstruction again of this notion of community. I also spent a year there, and in many ways, this experience has nuanced my understanding of what it means to be a political agent and what it means to practice visibility and invisibility in the urban realm. So in many ways, mediatization, aestheticization of context, as borrowed from the political scientist Sebastian Thierry, it's a strategy for the depolitization of complex social environments in order to repoliticize them again, offering the possibility of a proliferation of otherwise invisible narratives, countering dominant perceptions, offering new territories for social and political encounter. And so we make in the North End, as part of this project that lasted and continues to go forward, we made publications, we told stories of people like David Bourgon, the owner of Red's Jazz Shoeshine. We featured articles by residents like Dee Costello and Anika Jackson, some of whom provided us with fictional ideas about how they would prefer to be seen and about the businesses they would prefer to have, while others shared real renditions of the material aspects of their lives. And ultimately, the project offered a space for continued social expression, public appropriation, and experimentation. And this, to us, this kind of linky aestheticization, in order to be able to come to terms with difficult questions, was the first strategy of encounter. And the next chapters are shorter, so we can go faster. So the second, the next one is about making a scene. And in particular, I'm very inspired by the junk playgrounds designed in Copenhagen by Carl Theodor Sorensen. If you're unfamiliar with these projects, they're easy to get a hold of. There are some publications that are quite extraordinary and exuberant, but basically the story is that around the early 30s, this landscape architect was very frustrated by the fact that no children enjoyed playing in his landscapes. And he recognized that they did enjoy playing on construction sites and other spaces of coming undoneness. And so he decided to recreate some of the possibilities of a junk playground in which children themselves could shape, dream, and imagine an alternate reality. And so this became a thing. You know, the first playgrounds, they were part of the Workers' Cooperative Housing Association in Endrop, Denmark, where this happened again during the German occupation. And they continued to spread. You know, at the height of this typology, there were about 100 adventure playgrounds throughout the country. The playgrounds at Endrop grew out of a spirit of a kind of resistance to Nazi occupation. And parents ultimately began to fear that their children's play might be mistaken for acts of sabotage by soldiers. And so ultimately, by the end of the 30s, it became unfashionable to allow your children to play in these kinds of playgrounds. Today, you can still find these playgrounds in certain sites across Denmark. They've been normalized. They are no longer spaces of construction and infinite reconstruction. It's no longer kind of Freudian play. But nonetheless, there is something to be borrowed from the invention of this fantasy. The fantasy was produced through an act of the creation of a landscape of autonomy that screened out the banal aspects of the public housing units into which the spaces were embedded. And the second invention was that the idea that Sorensen had was not to replace civic infrastructure, but rather to augment knowledge about the infinite play of construction and deconstruction. In other words, the children were not tasked with replacing missing infrastructure or building permanent solutions to their needs. They built and unbuilt, and using the same material, they were producing knowledge rather than producing solution-based outcomes. So while the project aesthetically might be read or might channel the ethos of DIY construction, in my opinion, they're anything but. They're the dematerialization of a kind of production of space through the infinite making and remaking. So there's much to be learned from the work of Sorensen in the way that we practice ourselves. On the surface, the effort resembles the aesthetics of the social turn termed by Claire Bishop as a return to collaborative and participatory forms of creative practice, an affirmation of collectivity, of positivism, of deliberate democracy and processes of inclusion, elimination of disruption. The elevation of participation as a method of collective humanization in an otherwise very difficult and tumble world. But as Claire Bishop has noted, the social turn also has a darker and more sinister side, disguising real social need by superficially repairing the social bond and helping everyone cope with deregulation and disintegration of a state-sanctioned social network and welfare system. The onus, in other words, is on the participant. We build with others, we build together, but we remain doggedly critical about the possibility of it replacing permanent cultural infrastructure with these DIY efforts. So on the surface, the work might be misconstrued as participatory or co-creational or engaging citizen action, but it requires a certain level of expertise and formal know-how. So ultimately, we build these scenographies, we build them collectively. We offer them as spaces of social interaction, of cultural encounter, and it helps us spin stories, create publications, and change perception about the value and condition of place. And so in this sense, while our representation might be